Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be learning how to draw a skull. Now, there are many reasons why someone would want to learn how to draw a skull. On one hand, skulls are easily integratable into various artworks. Throughout history, skulls have often been used in all sorts of ways, whether it is an object utilized within a still life or as a symbol integrated into an artwork to represent death, decay. There are many reasons to learn how to draw a skull, and specifically within the genres of anatomy drawing, it is really useful to understand the formation of the skull and how this has an effect on various facial features and how they are placed together due to this unique composition of bone structure within the skull. So learning how to draw a skull is really useful in many ways, not only as a visual element for your own artwork, but more specifically as this very unique, evolved anatomical structure that not only encases our brain, but also describes beneath the surface of the skin why the human composition looks the way it does in terms of the facial features. That being said, in this tutorial we'll be looking at how to draw a skull from a side angle. The reason why we do this is learning how to draw a skull in this particular way also helps us understand the depth of these different features and how they kind of form around the structure as opposed to being flat, giving us a better sense of the three-dimensional qualities of this unique feature with its various protruding features as well as indentations that are unique to the skull. Now, with that being said, we can get started with a light pencil sketch, and the way in which we're going to start is we're going to basically draw a circle on the page, which is going to serve as a demarcation line to establish the scale of how large our skull drawing would be. So what we can do is we can just draw a simple circle. From there, what we want to start doing is we're going to start working with this side angle frontal view, which is going to kind of show how the parietal bone, which is kind of the encasing or the larger bone structure at the back of the skull, flows into the coronal suture and ultimately into the frontal bone, where we start to see the formation of the eye sockets, otherwise known as the ethmoid bones, such as the orbital plate, the middle nasal concha, and so on and so on. So what we can start doing is we can actually start drawing the top of the skull. In this tutorial within the links, you'll find that there is a reference image, but you can also find various reference images online to assist you as you proceed with your own drawing. However, what we want to do first is we want to kind of work in tandem with both a light pencil, maybe something like an HB, and our pencil. And this is the stage of the drawing where we kind of start lightly sketching in these features, starting by the top of the head and slowly working your way down to the zygomatic bones, which are basically the cheekbones that form around the eye sockets. We can slowly start to work down all the way towards the mandible, where we will start drawing in the features that define the upper and lower section of the jaw. So the mandible is another word for the jaw, and basically it's formed of the ramus and the mental foramen, which basically defines that square-like structure which we identify as a jawline. Now, when it comes to the eye sockets, something we really want to consider is that the surrounding features, such as the zygomatic bone as well as the frontal bone, is going to create this protruding brow ridge. Now, when we think about our eyebrows and why they protrude over our eyeballs or our eyelids, it's because that frontal bone kind of protrudes slightly and then kind of goes downwards and flows in an indented formation towards the zygomatic bones, which then protrude once again to define the cheekbones. So we'll find that as we flow from the top of the head, there's this indented quality that then arcs back outward to form the zygomatic bones, which are the cheekbones. And this is something we want to consider, especially as we draw in these features from a side view. Now, the same can be said for the nasal bone. The nasal bone has this slight protrusion which kind of forms from the central bone, which is the forehead between both eye sockets, and protrudes outward as well. And we want to kind of establish its protrusion as we continue to draw this skull at the side feature view. Something we want to think about is obviously that the skull has various orifices. Obviously the mouth is one of them, and we can see those two gaps on either side of the mandible or the jaw. on either side of the teeth, but we also understand that the eye sockets as well as the nasal passage form part of these few orifice features within the face. Now, obviously, that being said, it means that the quality of the nasal passage is going to move inward, and the way in which we can define that is going to be with some light shading. So as we proceed with drawing in these features, we don't necessarily need to work in dark details just yet, but we do want to kind of go through these various features and make sure they correlate in terms of placement and scale. Now, another thing to think about when it comes to the eye socket is they're not necessarily perfect in a circular fashion, but they kind of have this square-like quality to them. So another way to think about it is almost as if you were drawing sunglasses, like Ray-Ban sunglasses on the skull, and that's kind of the shape of these eye sockets. The eye sockets aren't these perfect circular structures, but more of a combination between a circle and square-like structure. The eye sockets also kind of arc downwards. They're not necessarily completely straight. However, they do fall along the same plane, which means that we want to make sure that as we draw them in, they form along the same vertical plane on either side of the face. Now, when we're drawing features from a side angle, there are things that we want to consider, and this is particularly true for protruding qualities or protruding features. So when we think about the nasal bone, we really want to make sure that that nasal bone sticks outward, which will cause the right eye socket to be slightly less visible. However, obviously, because the zygomatic bone, the cheekbones, protrude as well, we will find that that cheekbone will protrude from behind the nasal bone. Again, it's really important for us to remember that at this early stage, what we're trying to do is basically just work in these features and try and place them correctly next to one another, making sure that the placement makes sense, scale makes sense. Something also important to consider is that the nasal bone is quite similar in scale to that of the eye sockets, so that's something to really think about. Now, the eye sockets tend to be quite large, but the nasal bone as well. The only difference here is the shape. Obviously, the nasal bone has this more arrowhead-like shape. The orifice of the nasal passage is quite arrowhead or at least triangular, whereas the passage or the orifice of the eye sockets tend to be quite circular and squarish. So these are some things we want to consider. Now, as we proceed with sketching in these details, what we want to start thinking about is how these features flow into each other and how they kind of seamlessly connect. Now, for instance, something unique about the skull is this very tiny bone beneath the nasal passage, which is called the anterior nasal spine. And this, when we kind of look at a facial feature and how we define this quality on the surface of the skin, it's that little connecting piece of cartilage that flows from the top of the nose or the tip of the nose to the bottom lip fulcrum area. And this is something that we really want to think about in terms of establishing how this feature flows into the lower features of the skull. Now, there's something to understand about the skull. Now, the skull is made up of these larger bone structures that connect together, which then are made up of smaller features. Now, below the nasal passage, what we see is this main middle section that defines the connection point between the cheekbones, which are called the zygomatic bones, and the upper row of teeth. Now, that whole bone structure surrounding the nasal passage connecting to the upper row of teeth is called the maxilla, and this kind of forms the features just below the nasal passage, which include the anterior nasal spine, that little protruding bone structure beneath the nasal passage, and kind of flows into the upper plate that connects to the upper row of teeth. What is also a part of this structure is infraorbital foramen, and that is basically those two little indentations next to or on either side of the large nasal passage that connects to the zygomatic bones, or also known as the cheekbones. So we really want to consider looking at a diagram of a skull as we proceed with our drawing, because what's going to happen is it's going to assist us in understanding these structures a little bit more in depth, which is going to assist us in drawing the skull a little bit more effectively. And this is also going to help us understand how far certain features protrude or how deep certain features are indented within the skull. Now, something especially unique about the skull is that over the course of about 12,000 years, it has evolved significantly due to the introduction of agriculture, which enabled us to kind of find alternative means of eating foods, which tended to be much softer. So our ancestors before then would need a larger mandible in order to crush raw fruits, vegetables, and meats and so on. Now, as we proceed with our drawing, it's nice to know and understand that this is the influence on the jaw shape, which has resulted in a more petite and softer and much smaller jaw size. So we'll find that the cranium and the bones that form the cranial area will always be much larger than the jaw structure. So we'll find that the jaw structure has this subtle protrusion, but as it forms the mandible, or kind of the mandible structure forms around the upper row of teeth and the maxilla bone plate that is placed basically on the front area of the face, we will find that it kind of comes back inward again, and ultimately not protruding too much. We'll also find that as we draw in the rows of teeth and slowly start to shift towards the jaw, we will find that the jaw structure does have this 90-degree angle. But as we continue with our drawing, we first want to slowly form the maxillar bone structure that forms into the upper jaw section, which also establishes the top row of teeth. Now, again, it's important to understand the anatomical nature of the teeth and how it is formed around this maxillar plate that is placed basically on the front section of the face, or forms the front section of the skull near the nasal passage. And obviously the teeth are comprised of a variety of different teeth types. So we have our molars, our first molars, our canine teeth, our incisors, lateral incisors, and then central incisors, which establish or could be identified as the two front teeth. Now, as we proceed with drawing in the top row of teeth, we want to make sure that we first establish that plate that sits in the front of the skull. Again, that bone structure is called the maxilla, and it is basically the bone structure that connects to the zygomatic bones, or the cheekbones, and forms around the nasal passage. As the zygomatic bones kind of move to the side or temple areas of the skull, it starts to become more narrow, and it flows into the articular tubercle, which is basically this narrowing bone structure that connects to the zygomatic bones and slowly forms into the zygomatic process, which is a plate or another part of the skull that is situated near the temples, basically the side sections of the skull. Now, this is another kind of segmentation that is attached to the broader cranium area, and that particular ridge, that narrowed protruding ridge that flows from the zygomatic bones to the back of the cranium, kind of has this groove where the mandible, or the upper section of the mandible called the mandibular fossa, connects into that bone structure. So when we think about a mandible, it's similar to a joint structure, so it needs to move, and that mandibular fossa basically has a circular composition or shape that fits into that groove near the articular tubercle. So these are the kinds of segmentations and componentry of the skull that kind of connect to one another and start to form this kind of ball bearing or joint flexibility between the mandible and the larger cranium area. Now, obviously, when we draw the skull from a side angle, these particular features will be a little bit more visible, obviously making it really important for us to understand how the upper mandible area kind of connects to that zygomatic arch, and that is basically that area section where the zygomatic bones slowly connect cranial bones positioned in the back of the head, such as the occipital bone or the temporal bone. Now, as we continue and slowly work our way down to the shaping of the lower jaw area, we want to understand that that lower jaw area, or what is called the mental foramen area, kind of becomes a little bit more squarish, and we also want to make sure that the scale or the height of that area is enough to still place in the lower row of teeth. So this is why we want to make sure that we first work in the maxilla plate and work in that top row of teeth, making sure we understand the scale of these tooth structures in comparison to the maxilla, and how they flow around the maxilla structure in that three-dimensional kind of cylindrical formation. From there we can proceed to drawing in the jaw structure and ultimately working it towards the zygomatic arch that connects to the back of the cranium, and then we can start working in the lower row of teeth. And again, this part of the process is simply about understanding the diagrammatical nature of these elements and how they connect to one another. We also try and understand how these features protrude in various ways, how these indentations are formed due to these various protrusions, and how do we spend time using our eraser and pencil to form these features in a light pencil sketch. Now, as we continue with this process, again, it's really important for us to consider the scale of these two connecting features. And by the two connecting features, what is meant is the mandible area that connects the jaw to the cranium area. Now, this is especially important near the zygomatic arch, which is that thinner, narrow ridge that connects the zygomatic bones to the back bones, or the occipital bone and the temporal bone. And we want to make sure that we're creating that groove area where the upper section of the mandible, the ramus and the coronoid process kind of have this arcing shape that flows into that little groove near the zygomatic arch. As we proceed with sketching in these details, we'll also find that they kind of flow into each other. So as we continue with the jaw area, the upper mandible area connects in it to these features near the zygomatic arch or near the eardrum. We'll find that we can start flowing into the back cranium area, and this is where we start to see that arcing kind of shape of the occipital bone and the temporal bone, as well as the parietal bone, and how it kind of downturns and curves inward back in towards the areas near the zygomatic arch connecting to the upper mandible area. So make sure you take your time and kind of working out these details, making sure that they connect accurately. Again, spend time working with your eraser and your pencil, making sure you develop a light sketch of the skull, focusing mainly on shape, proportion and scale at this point in the tutorial. As we continue, we want to bring our attention back to the lower row of teeth. And again, now when we're dealing with teeth, we really want to make sure that the size of the teeth makes sense in relation to the maxillar plate, that is the bone on the front of the face that forms around the nasal passage and connects to the top row of teeth, and then as well as the mandible area, and how the lower row of teeth forms along the mental foramen, which is the actual chin or jaw line of the skull. When drawing teeth kind of on a skull or a facial feature from a side view, we obviously want to think of the subtle distortion that's going to happen in the shape of the teeth, and that's obviously because some teeth will be slightly less visible due to the angle at which the skull is being drawn. We also want to consider the scale between the upper row of teeth and the lower row of teeth. Now, the lower row of teeth are comprised of incisors, cuspids, premolars and molars. And again, it's important for us to also understand that the lower row of teeth tend to be much more narrow and smaller than the upper row of teeth. Again, we also want to make sure that we are thinking about the curvature in the three-dimensional structure of the jaw. Now, naturally, again, because we're drawing the skull from a side view, what we are getting is this rotation in features. And this is particularly true for the jaw area as well as the teeth, as they kind of rotate around the lower part of the face or in the mandible, and we start to see how the molars and premolars for both the upper and lower row of teeth form in this cylindrical rounding action towards the zygomatic bones, the maxilla, as well as the zygomatic arch that starts to connect to the back of the cranium. Now, once we have kind of worked in a sketch of all these necessary features and we've worked out placement, we want to start working in some generalized shading. Now, again, because there are various orifices within the skull, such as the eye sockets as well as the nasal passage, we want to create that distinction between the other features. So naturally, those features will struggle to have light present within those areas due to the fact that they're indented inside the skull, or they are passages or orifices within the skull, so light would naturally struggle to penetrate those areas. And the way in which we can create a distinction between those areas and the surface area of features that are protruding on the skull is by the utilization of shading. Now, we also don't necessarily just want to utilize shading in the orifice areas of the skull or the orifice features. We want to start thinking now about the textural quality of the skull, and this is where we start to use our shading as a means of defining different features a little bit more effectively. Now, when we think about bones, we tend to think about this more smooth surface, but this is not necessarily the case holistically for a skull. In many ways, because the skull is made of bone, which is this mixture of calcium phosphate as well as protein and collagen, it tends to have these more gritty, toothy textures with grain in certain areas. And this is where we can kind of try to use our shading as a way of defining these qualities. Now again, the skull is a three-dimensional structure, so within these various features we'll also find that they will tend to have these smaller grooves, curvatures, and subtle indentations along the surface area. So for instance, when we think about the jaw structure, for instance, or the mandible, we can see that the mental foramen has a kind of protrusion or indentation that causes curvature within the chin, and this is also true for the upper mandible area near the ramus or the coronoid process, where it starts to connect to the zygomatic arch. And this is something we want to think about. We want to think about the different bone segments, such as the zygomatic bones, the lacrimal bones, as well as the nasal passage, and how these different features have these smaller little indentations and protrusions of bone structures within these various features. So the more time we take kind of analyzing and looking at different diagrams and representations of skulls, the better chance we're going to have in terms of effectively representing these features, and this is where our shading process begins with our pencil. So moving on to utilizing a darker pencil, we want to start working through all of these various features, kind of working in some shading to further emphasize and enhance these features, starting with the frontal area of the skull. Now this is where we kind of start to pay attention to which areas of the skull would be slightly darker due to indentation or grooves, but we're not only using shading in order to emphasize the little gaps within the skull, we're also going to use our shading to kind of define the structure a little further. Now this is where we really want to consider the protrusions and the indentations that kind of form along the surface area of the skull or within the skull. So naturally, obviously, when we think about the orifices such as the eye sockets as well as the nasal passage, we're going to apply a little bit of dark shading to those areas to kind of emphasize that distinction, that light is obviously less visible there, or struggles to penetrate those areas compared to that of the more exposed surface areas. We also want to start thinking about the zygomatic bone structures, and this is particularly important because we are drawing the skull from a side angle. So what we are seeing is that zygomatic arch that becomes more narrow and starts to flow to the back of the skull towards the bones that obviously lie at the back, such as the occipital bone or the temporal bone. We can start to see that the groove needs to be defined a little bit more with the use of shading. Now again, the segmentations within the skull are actually divided by something called the coronal suture, and if we think about it in more of like a segmentation stuck together like Lego, the coronal suture is basically the connection points where we can actually see the line defined within the skull that creates the distinctions between these various segments stuck together. So the skull quite strangely looks as if it's been pasted together in parts, and the coronal suture is this line that kind of flows down the central area of the skull from one temple all the way around to the crown of the skull, and then to the other temple on the other side of the skull. We can see that this then divides into the sphenoid bone, which is basically the small bone in the temple area. It also creates a distinction between the parietal bone, which lies at the back of the head, and the frontal bone, which lies on the forehead of the head. And that's the two main distinctions, or the two main sections that are placed on the front side of the skull and the back side of the skull. So as we proceed with our pencil shading, what we want to start doing is we want to consider not only texture and how we can utilize our shading to emphasize the texture, where we kind of use not only shading marks but stippling marks to emphasize this grainy quality in certain areas of the skull, such as the mandible. But then we also want to really think about how these different features protrude ever so slightly, and in other cases quite significantly. So obviously, naturally, something like the zygomatic bones are going to protrude a lot more significantly than smaller features such as these little cracks, such as the coronal suture, which creates these segmentations. Now, we want to spend a lot of time on the frontal area or the frontal features, and this is where we start working shading into the orifices, but also around the orifices. We also find that the skull has these two indentations within the maxilla, placed quite near the zygomatic bones, and these little smaller holes are also quite significant within the skull. So there are these smaller features we really want to pay attention to, and this is why we want to consider looking at a diagrammatical view of a skull or more medical drawings of a skull, because this is going to give us a little bit more in-depth detail of what the skull is constituted of in terms of features. Now, as we proceed with the shading process, we really want to kind of use our shading to define the more subtle grooves. For instance, the maxilla bone, as it starts to kind of near or connect to the upper teeth, we'll find these slight ridges that define these grooves or indentations that flow along the gaps in between the larger or the upper row of teeth. And this is something we really want to define with our shading. So when we think about the skull, again, there are going to be more subtle shifts in form within the various features. So when we think about something like the mandible, from the top mandible section all the way to the lower mandible area, there is a subtle indentation or curvature within the surface area of the mandible, as well as those small grooves below the bottom row of teeth where it connects to the lower section of the mandible, which is the mental foramen. Now, again, this is something we really want to spend time on. The more shading we add to our drawing with pencil, the more realistic our drawing is ultimately going to be. And we can also be a little bit strategic with how we utilize shading in tandem with negative space. So again, a skull is obviously comprised of various surface areas that protrude and obviously have indentations, which is going to be exposed to a light source in different ways, and this is going to create areas that are quite highlighted and some areas that are quite darkened. So as we proceed with our shading, this is really important for us to think about, because when we work in our shading, we want to think about which areas are going to be least exposed to light. We can also be quite specific about which direction or which side the light source is coming from. Now, as we continue to add in shading, again, we're not just doing it to darken any sort of orifice area or create shadowing around any protruding area, but we're also trying to use our shading in different ways to add more texture and tonal variety to the drawing. Now, at this point, we should have a well-established skull in a drawing and kind of worked in some shading that ultimately defines these different features. But again, the idea here is you can kind of start to be a little playful once you understand the features of the skull and you understand how they are placed together. We can be a little bit more creative about how we integrate our shading and mark making into our skull drawing, and this is where our own artistic intervention starts to play a role in terms of darkening our skull, lightening it in certain areas, creating more emphatic marks that define certain features a little bit more significantly, but ultimately what we do want to do in this first pencil stage is make sure we understand the general shape, make sure that we understand the features, the scale of the features, how they kind of fit together, how they flow into one another, and ultimately how that holistically creates this realistic representation of a human skull. Now, once we have done with our pencil drawing and our pencil shading, we're going to transition into darkening these features with a darker medium. In this particular tutorial, we'll be using ballpoint pen. You can use any medium you like. However, ballpoint pen is really good because it works quite similar to pencil. And that is because the ink comes out quite sparingly, which gives us a lot more autonomy and agency over our mark making process. So what we want to do now is we basically want to use our ballpoint pen and kind of use the pencil marks as a means of guiding us as we start to integrate some darker contrasted shading with our pen. So a good suggestion would be to kind of start with the most distinct areas that are dark, and this includes areas such as the orifices, such as the eye sockets, where we can start to create those subtle gradient shifts from dark to light. Another thing to think about is when we integrate pen shading into our drawing, we are for the most part going to be working in a lot of gradient shifts. So for instance, when you think about something like the eye sockets, the deeper inside the skull the eye socket goes, obviously the darker the marks, but because we're drawing the skull from a side view, we'll also see bones such as the orbital plate, which is placed quite near to the outer rim of the eye socket, and therefore those areas will be slightly lighter. So we want to think more realistically in terms of how features become slightly more lighter as they become more exposed to a light source, and this is particularly true for the orifice areas. We want to create that gradient shift that kind of goes from dark, where it's representing how the passages kind of go deep into the skull, and then slightly lighten as they come towards the surface area of the skull and eventually flow into the surface area or the outer features on the surface of the skull. So this is something to think about. When we also think about how these features connect, such as how the nasal bone is connected to the frontal bone, or how the maxilla plate is connected to the zygomatic bones, we can also be a little bit more strategic with line work, and this is where we can create those little fine distinctions made by the coronal suture that creates those segments throughout the entire skull. So try to kind of have this thought pattern as you proceed with your pen shading process. Another good thing with ballpoint pen is to kind of keep some scrap paper nearby, and that way you can kind of sketch out any excess buildup of ink in the pen before you proceed with your shading process. You really want to make sure you just take your time kind of going through features one at a time and slowly working your way through the entire skull. Again, as we proceed with our pen shading process, we're kind of thinking about the same things where we're trying to understand the more subtle details in terms of how these features connect to one another. So as we slowly work our way through the face, working down towards the teeth and slowly working our way through the maxilla plate, take your time thinking about how the maxilla plate kind of has this arcing protruding quality that flows into the zygomatic bones or the cheekbones, and we want to obviously make sure that we try our best to represent these smaller details, such as the anterior nasal spine, that little protruding bone below the nasal passage, as well as the little indentations that run along the bottom section of the maxilla plate that connects to the top row of teeth. Naturally, as we proceed with our pen shading process, other things we can think of are the little orifice areas or the little holes or gaps within the skull that aren't necessarily clear orifice features such as eye sockets and nasal passages, but areas such as the gaps in between the teeth or the gaps on either side of the mandible. We want to think through features such as this and how to create that distinction between those areas and the surface area of the skull. And this is where shading is really important, because it's going to establish that depth quality that's going to give your skull a more realistic three-dimensional aesthetic. So with those little gaps, we really want to make sure we darken them. The more we darken them, naturally it's going to pull out the other features and ultimately bring them forward, creating that quality of depth. So remember, what we are trying to do during this pen shading process is not necessarily integrate new marks, but to kind of use the pencil marks as a means of guiding our pen shading process. So we should have pencil shading already established in our skull drawing, and these pencil marks are basically going to just help us or assist us as we proceed with pen shading. Now, again, something important to consider is these gradient shifts. And by gradient shifts, what I mean is as we shade, we're creating these little transitions or seamless transitions between dark shadows and highlighted areas. And this is particularly true for the more subtle features in the skull, or the subtle shadowing that forms along less obvious areas on the skull. So for instance, when we think about the frontal bone or the forehead, we'll find that that surface area is quite large, However, it has subtle grooves and indentations that kind of define the brow ridge, and then slowly kind of indents towards the temples. So we want to use our shading very strategically to create those transitions with the utilization of seamless gradients throughout our shading process, which ultimately will define those qualities in a more realistic way. So we really want to make sure we take our time and try our best to be very subtle with these transitions, and this means we want to layer our shading. So something to note about ballpoint pen as well is we don't necessarily want to push too hard. Paying attention to the pressure that we apply to our pen is really essential in terms of creating this soft layering effect on top of one another to create various tonal values. So we don't want to necessarily make dark marks straight away, but what we do want to do is kind of have a light pressure applied to the pen and create some light shading marks and build them up until we achieve a certain tonal value that we really appreciate, or at least looks correct within our skull drawing. Another thing to think about is our tonal range, and this is where we start to think about how a monochromatic medium such as pen and pencil that kind of obviously work with a single color range can be used to represent various tonal values within the skull. And this is why this idea of building up layers of pen shading is essential to create those seamless gradients. It is also important to think about how we create that quality of depth by really dark marks within the gaps and the orifice features of the skull, and then slightly lighten our shading process or shading marks as we come to features that are a little bit more exposed on the surface of the skull. Now, as we continue down through the frontal features and slowly work our way into the maxilla, again, we want to think about how we use our shading not only to establish grooves and subtle curves and indentations that flow along the surface area or more exposed surface areas of the skull, but we can also think about how to integrate other marks like stippling or line work to provide a more enriched textural quality to our skull drawing. This is where our artistic intervention again plays a major role, because we can be a little bit more playful with giving our skull unique textural features or qualities along these surface areas. And this is up to you. If you want to add line work around certain areas or stippling to create a more grainy texture, there are many ways we can utilize our drawing techniques and skills in order to achieve these qualities. Now, as we start to slowly transition from the frontal areas and work our way up to the mandible, we should find that as we darken any gaps within the skull and kind of lighten more visible areas on the surface of the skull, we'll start to see how that realistic three-dimensional quality becomes a little bit more prominent. The more shading and the more gradients we integrate into more subtle features such as flatter or more exposed surface areas, again, this is going to enhance the realistic three-dimensional quality of the drawing. I think this process of using our pen to shade is more a matter of time and patience. The more time we spend on a feature and slowly work our way through the entire skull, the higher the chance of our drawing being a more realistic representation of a human skull. Something also important to remember is as we start coming to the zygomatic bones or the cheekbones that flow from the front of the face to the side of the face, we again want to think about how that protrudes from the temple area or the parietal bone of the skull. So naturally that bone structure will be quite protruding as it flows to the temple or side areas of the skull. And what we want to do is we want to make sure we integrate some shading gradients in and around those features. So for instance, the zygomatic bone is a good example of how we can shade a little bit more darkly around the feature to create a quality of depth whilst leaving the zygomatic bone or the zygomatic arch that flows towards the back of the skull slightly lighter. Or we can integrate some shading into the zygomatic arch that is slightly lighter than the shading around it. And this is what we want to think about in terms of creating qualities of depth and how to create this effect of protruding or more three-dimensional features that form along the surface area of the skull. So as you continue with your shading, you can slowly transition those shadow gradients that form around the zygomatic bone or zygomatic arch and flow into the back area, such as the parietal bone, which is the larger surface area on the back of the skull. We can kind of transition those darker gradients and slightly lighten them as they come to a more exposed surface area, such as the back of the skull. So this process is really about considering the nature of the various features and how a light source would interact with them. Would they be darker? Would they be lighter? And why would they be darker? Why would they be lighter? Would they be lighter because they protrude and therefore are more exposed to a light source? Or will they be darker because they are covered by protruding features and therefore there will be more shadow presence within those areas? And we want to think about how these features kind of transition and form seamlessly or flow seamlessly between one another, and therefore we integrate shading that kind of defines that quality of a seamless shadow shift, where we can kind of work in seamless shading that flows from darker to lighter. So working those gradients within the skull is also going to be really essential during this process of using your pen to emphasize details within the skull. But otherwise, guys, this is basically the process of how to draw a realistic skull. Just to break down some key things to think about. For one, you really want to first understand the general shape and form of a skull. Secondly, you want to understand how these features are connected to one another, how they flow into one another, and this is where we think about scale and placement. So spending a large portion of time making sure your pencil sketch is done correctly before adding shading is essential. From there, you want to start thinking about the compositional or three-dimensional qualities of these features. Do they protrude? Are they orifice in nature? Do they have this indentation quality? And how does that kind of affect the way shadow formation can be integrated throughout these features, and kind of how they shift from these darkened shadow areas to these lightened shadow areas. And then lastly, it's about spending time working your shading into the drawing, and this is where that kind of consideration of shadow formation in terms of understanding the three-dimensional nature of the features plays a role, and this is where we want to think about how to represent those shadow formation with our shading. And then lastly, ultimately, it's about enhancing those features and shadow formations with a darker medium, and this is where you can use either darker pencils or a pen, and then again, it's simply a matter of taking your time. But what is highly recommended is definitely looking at some examples, drawings, diagrammatical representations of realistic skulls to get a better sense of these features and how they kind of work together. But otherwise, this is the general process and some concepts to think about as you pursue a more realistic representational drawing of a skull. I hope there were some really helpful key points and principles that you can take away from this drawing process. Feel free to come back to it if you feel like you need to consider or reconsider some ideas within your own drawing process. Otherwise, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. We'll be covering a couple anatomical drawing topics, so stay tuned. Until next time, cheers guys, thanks.